I feel like a lot of people aren't willing to face reality when it comes to this situation. People aren't willing to acknowledge what's staring them right in the face. They don't want to admit it's true. They don't want to admit that this is a possibility because it goes against everything that they've been led to believe this year. The Nintendo Switch is not going to be replaced by the Nintendo Switch 2. The Nintendo Switch 2 is essentially like a new model of the Nintendo Switch. It is essentially a Game Boy Color, and the evidence of that can be seen by the simple fact that more games have been confirmed to release for Nintendo Switch in 2025. Now, the cope right now is that these are all like last gen ports and that they don't really mean anything and it doesn't amount to anything. Like, oh, Pokemon Legends ZA is Pokemon is always late to move on to the next piece of hardware, but when you actually look at what's coming out, stuff like Professor Layton, Deca Police, Xenoblade Chronicles X this month, you get this really strong sense that the console is not going to be abandoned, right? This thing is going to be supported for years after the Nintendo Switch 2 is released. And what that means is it's going to continue selling new consoles and it's going to continue getting new games. I would be very surprised if the vast majority of games that are releasing on Nintendo Switch would not also release on Nintendo Switch 2. So essentially, what we're going to see is that the Nintendo Switch will be a clear incremental upgrade, just like how the Game Boy Color was an upgrade, just like how the Game Boy Advance SP was an upgrade, the new 3DS, that style of thing where it's just, you know, a slight small upgrade to existing affordable hardware. The things that people are spouting now, the typical cope of like, well, it's not powerful enough to compete. What games are you playing that take advantage of the PlayStation and Xbox's expensive hardware? And don't even get me started on the gaming PC, which that piece of slop. But like when you look at like what Nintendo is doing, it's just a typical repeat of their pattern. They have a major success and they reiterate on that success. They made the Wii and then they improved on it with the Wii U. So the Switch 2 is essentially going to like continue what the Nintendo Switch did, but it is not necessarily going to supplant it. And it certainly isn't going to tank Switch sales like so many people who believe the PS2 sold 100 million units after the PS3 came out actually believe. The Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be a huge phenomenal success, but the Nintendo Switch will continue to be extremely relevant going forward with its budget releases, with its new games that are available on both platforms, with its digital storefront. This thing is going to be very, very relevant for a very, very long time. Like even now, today, you have this quote from a lot of people like, oh, I haven't touched my Switch since 2023, completely ignoring all the great games that have not only come out since then, but the backlog of stuff that they deliberately ignored when it first came out, right? This idea that like, oh, nothing's coming out on this thing, it's a complete and utter cope and always has been. Like I remember even back in 2018 people were saying that like, oh, this thing doesn't have enough games, but it's just the narrative is falling apart and it has been for a very long time. Like Pokemon is a really good example of this. What are people saying in regards to like modern AAA games, right? They need to be smaller in scope, they need to look they need to not look as good. They need to focus more on the gameplay mechanics, right? You know, everything that everyone is saying modern AAA games should do are things that Pokemon have been doing for years. Like scaling it back, making these games constantly put out new ones, right? People love to like glass like Witcher 3, like, oh man, it sold 70 million units or whatever. Like that thing is sells for $5 on Humble Bundle all the time. Like you see that going for like nothing on Steam all the time, right? That's the bulk of like The Witcher's relevancy is like people who think it's like Game of Thrones and it being on sale all the time. And then meanwhile, when you compare it to a much more successful, iconic, lucrative brand like Pokemon, they're releasing games that sell more than that all the time at full price, right? This is something that a lot of people don't really understand. Like, this come up with like the Power World thing too. Like, oh man, it sold just as many copies as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. No, it didn't. Selling at half price. Lying about the sales numbers, right? Like, even with everything they've done to try and like win over like the Western gaming sphere, right? Like they didn't even come close to touching like not only Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, but like everything else they did that year, right? They don't have a Pokemon TCG equivalent. Their merchandise will never be as popular, right? And not only that, like they're gonna get shut down because of due to plagiarism, right? How World is like a very good example of just how people will prop up a mediocre product just to try to get one up over Nintendo, right? And we've been seeing this for years, right? If you're like me, you grew up like seeing people like throw all sorts of things at like, well, Grand Theft Auto is better than Zelda because like, oh, you're in a city, or like, it's more mature, or like, Dark Cloud, Okame, oh, Darksiders, oh, like the Zelda killer, the mythical Zelda killer that never actually came to be, right? Like you grew up hearing this thing all the time, this narrative that Zelda had fallen off, that nobody liked it anymore, that like Nintendo fans just couldn't move on to like the real games, and now in 2025, the narrative has completely collapsed. They blew their load with Skyrim, like, oh, Nintendo will never make an open world game better than this, and then they did, and the industry still hasn't recovered from it, right? And honestly, I don't think they ever will. After how they handled the Tears of the Kingdom thing, like this is the thing people don't understand about Tears of the Kingdom. They're really going to tell you when the next Zelda game comes out that it's not enough like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. After spending so much time trying to downplay Tears for being too much like Breath of the Wild, right? It's gonna kind of be like that like Majora's Mask going into like Wind Waker kind of thing again. Like, oh no, it's too different. Oh, this isn't what we wanted. It's like it's gonna fall flat. And I think that's like the trend we've been seeing when it comes to like these kind of Nintendo criticisms is that like they all just kind of fall flat because like these people will just complain no matter what. Like the Lonely Goomba, like I saw a lot of people on Twitter like addressing just how he always complains about like the most insane, like inane nonsense, right? And he's not the only one that does it, but the thing that's really interesting is that like more and more people are like calling out that kind of mentality, right? 5, 10 years ago, it was like, going after like that it the hating the anime tropes in video games and stuff like that. Like, oh, I'm a Nintendo fan and I don't play RPGs. I don't want anime in my games, right? Like, that 5 years ago that was kind of like the thing people were making fun of these people for, but like now it's kind of grown past that, I think. People are at the point where I was at like back in 2010, 2012, when like you would like browse these message boards and realize that like the people talking about Nintendo games online don't know anything about them at all, and like don't really respect them and are just trying to downplay them in order to like glaze up like absolute bullshit like Devil May Cry, Dragon's Dogma, Dark Souls. The list goes on, right? Like, and yeah, more people, after the Switch generation, I think more people are aware of like how these people operate. And like, like 10 years ago, like it was kind of a niche thing when like Jeff Keighley like deliberately undercut like Xenoblade Chronicles X. And now it's a minor controversy on Twitter. People noticed that he's been doing this consistently for the franchise ever since its inception. Like they can't keep doing this. They're embarrassing themselves. And with that being said, like how are they gonna downplay the Nintendo Switch 2? Right? Like how exactly are they gonna come out and like downplay this console, right? Right now they're like doing this thing where they're trying to set like gamers against like Trump supporters, like, oh man, Trump is gonna make the Switch 2 more expensive, and like I don't think anybody's gonna care about that, honestly. And like I supported it, if anything. So like to me, I feel like all the excuses that people like have traditionally used against Nintendo, like they're all falling apart. Like more people are becoming aware that like Nintendo was always the best in the industry, that it was always a facade, that the gaming PC thing, the copes, that like oh we can just pirate that. That's all just a giant lie. Like I really don't know where they're gonna go from here. Like I do think at this point the only people today who are still critical of Nintendo products are people who have been doing it for like 10, 20, 30 years, you know. The kind of people who were like crying about Super Mario World being too easy back in the day, right? You know, completely delusional and like anyone on the outside looking in can like tell these people are delusional, but they're so set in their ways that they're never ever going to change. But what's happened is that they have been replaced by a new modern audience that actually appreciates what Nintendo does and what they produce.